I can look after your horses if you give me a place to sleep." What the cowboy said next melted her heart. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you listening from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to give it a rating from 0 to 10. Now, lean back, breathe easy, and let the story carry you. The wind howled across the empty plains, carrying the scent of wet earth and the distant growl of thunder rolling off the mountains. Lightning split the sky, a jagged vein of silver flashing over a lonely ranch house where the dim flame of a kerosene lamp trembled against rotting shutters. Inside sat Elias Carter, a widowed cowboy, shoulders bent under the weight of years and memories, motionless, save for the faint creak of saddle leather swaying on the porch, whispering that life had not yet let go. Then came 3 knocks sharp, hollow, and lost against the storm. Knock, knock, knock. Elias lifted his eyes. His hand, almost by instinct, brushed the worn grip of the revolver resting beside his chair. He opened the door, and in the pale wash of lantern light stood a girl drenched through, trembling, her eyes clinging to the last scrap of hope she carried. Her voice cracked, barely louder than the rain. "I can look after your horses if you'll give me a place to sleep." And in that fragile moment, loneliness met desperation, and the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his reply. At the far edge of the railroad, the town was little more than a scar across the western map. Rusted freight cars shrieked as they rolled, leaving the bitter smoke of coal drifting in the cold wind. The saloon, mildew on its walls, leaned tired against the street of dust, its swinging doors groaning on rusted hinges. Beyond, the desert stretched without end, swallowing the horizon in the red fire of a dying sun. It was a land where men came to start over, or to disappear. Elias Carter rode in with the weight of a history no one dared ask about. 45 years old, a cowboy widowed, built strong but hollowed by grief. His boots carried the dust of too many roads. His wide-brimmed hat sagged heavy with rain, and his calloused hand never strayed far from the revolver at his hip, not as a threat, but as a reminder the world had never been kind. Folks said Elias spoke so little. The town had forgotten the sound of his voice. But in that silence lived something unyielding, an acceptance hardened like stone, carved by a land that forgave no one. That night, when Elias opened his ranch door, the flicker of lamplight fell across Clara's face. A stranger, soaked and shivering, her breath caught between fear and pleading. His silence tested her, yet it was also the first warmth she'd felt in months of being cast aside. And in that silence, a question lingers for you, the listener. If you were the cowboy riding into this town, what would be the first thing you'd do? Part 1. The flame on the wooden table. Outside, the rain hammered down on the roof, steady and unrelenting, mingling with the whistle of wind slipping through the cracks of the old doorframe. Inside, the faint scent of old ash lingered in the stove, where no fire had burned for many days. Elias stood leaning against the doorway, his shadow stretching long in the trembling glow of a kerosene lamp. His eyes followed the stranger who had just stepped in, Clara hair-soaked. Hands trembling, did not beg, did not plead. She simply knelt by the hearth and set to work, coaxing life back into the damp wood. Elias was not used to another presence in his house, a house quiet as a grave. Every sound she made echoed like a soft knocking against the walls of his chest, the crackle of kindling catching, the breath she gave to the flame. Slowly, a weak fire stirred, casting its timid glow across Clara's pale yet determined face. Elias lowered himself into the old chair beside the table. For years, that table had known only one bowl, one spoon, one shadow. Tonight, for the first time, the chair across from him held another figure. Fragile, yes, but real. The firelight touched her features, eyes that carried both fear and a fragile kind of faith. Elias said nothing, but inside, something tightened, like the ghost of long-forgotten suppers, with wife and child still lingered in the cracks of these walls. The room, once hollow and cold, now held a spirit again, kindled by a small flame, and a stranger whose stay was uncertain. From a small cloth pouch, Clara drew out a few dry kernels of corn, a pinch of salt. She dropped them into a dented pot and set it on the fire she'd coaxed to life. The simple smell of roasting corn rose up, filling the room. Elias never thought poverty could carry a fragrance warm enough to stir his heart. She did not look at him, her focus fixed on cooking. Perhaps she feared his hard gaze. Yet the silence between them carried no burden. It felt instead like an old melody, wordless but steady. Elias glanced at the lone dish on the table, stained by time. Almost without thinking, he reached for another bowl from the shelf, brushed off the thin coat of dust. That small act was an acceptance. Clara lifted her eyes, tears brimming, but her lips curved in the faintest smile. The corn popped in the pot, filling the cabin with its crackling song. Clara scooped it out, then sat opposite him. For a moment, the pounding storm outside faded to nothing. There were only two souls, sharing a humble meal. For Elias, it was the first time in years his wooden table was not his alone. The lamplight flickered, stretching their shadows long across the cabin wall. Elias chewed each bite slowly, his eyes drifting again and again to the chair across the table. The chair that had sat empty so long. Clara ate sparingly, as though afraid to take more than her share. Her hands were thin, marked with calluses from hard labor. Elias saw those hands, and memory struck his late wife's hands. The ones that once rocked a child to sleep, the ones that set a bowl of stew before him each evening. The thought choked him, and he forced down the corn to keep it from rising in his throat. Clara looked up, met his gaze. Neither spoke. Yet in that brief silence between their eyes, there was recognition. Two exiles from the world, now seated by the same fire. The empty chair was filled again, not with chatter, but with presence. Elias drew in a long breath, the heaviness in his chest easing, as though even the air inside the cabin had changed. After the meal, Clara tidied the table. She rinsed the bowls with rainwater kept in a clay jar, her hands shaking, but her movements careful. Elias remained seated, watching not the act itself, but the quiet perseverance behind it. In the wavering light, her thin shoulders, her rain-soaked hair stood out clearly. He did not know where she came from, nor what she had endured. Yet her patient, steady movements reminded him survival belongs to those who endure in silence. Elias turned a small knife in his hand, the same knife he had once used to carve his wife's and child's names into the porch beam after the fire. The marks remained, silent scars no one else ever read. Now, as Clara scrubbed dishes by the fire, Elias felt a space long empty begin to close, if only for a fleeting while. The air was no longer heavy. It had become a low, steady song. When the fire waned, Clara asked if she might rest on the long bench in the corner. She dared not ask for more, only a dry place to pass the night. Elias handed her a worn blanket, tattered, but still holding warmth. He returned to the table, silent, while the house filled with something new, the soft rhythm of another's breathing, a warmth woven with old memories. Elias brushed his fingers along the carved names in the beam, then let his eyes settle on Clara, curled beneath the blanket. A strange feeling swept his chest, painful, yet tender. Outside, the storm softened. The wind no longer screamed, as though even the desert itself was waiting to see what tomorrow would bring. Elias breathed deep, and for the first time in years, when he closed his eyes, the house did not feel too big, too empty. There was another breath in the room, and it was enough to keep the fire inside him from going out. And now, I'll leave you with a question. If you were in this cabin on that first night, would you sleep in peace, or would your hand still rest on the grip of your gun? Part 2. The old horse bows his head. Dawn came slow, without noise or fanfare. A thin veil of mist stretched over the pasture, softening the sight of weather-beaten fences. The wind carried the scent of damp earth left behind by the night's storm, stirring the brittle grass in the fields. Elias swung open the stable doors. The hinges groaned with rust, a sound that shattered the stillness of morning. Clara had been awake since the sky was still gray-blue. She had folded the ragged blanket, tied back her tangled hair, and followed the muffled rhythm of hooves echoing through the fog. The stable revealed itself, long rows of dark wood, the smell of hay mixed with horse sweat, and the gleam of bright, watchful eyes inside. Elias said nothing. He simply handed her a shovel and nodded. Clara returned the gesture. Stepping inside, damp straw clung to her thin shoes. Her hands trembled as she touched the rough edge of a feeding trough for the first time. In the far corner stood a gray horse, dusty. His coat had faded with age, his eyes deep and solemn, his long mane still heavy with last night's rain. He was the living witness of every loss Elias had endured, the one companion who had survived the fire. In Dusty's gaze was something even men seldom keep, a loyalty that never dimmed. Clara froze, her breath quickening. She knew this was her trial. A cowboy might not trust a stranger's word, but if his horse did, his heart would begin to crack. So she set to work. The sharp stink of manure burned her eyes as she shoveled wet straw into piles. Sweat beaded her brow. Though the morning air was cold, the other horses shifted, hooves scraping, but none resisted. They were used to Elias's presence, but hers was new. Elias leaned against the doorpost, arms folded, eyes fixed on Clara. He offered no guidance, no scolding, not even the faintest hint of approval. He only watched. For him, every action of hers was testimony, whether she truly meant to stay or whether her promise was empty. Clara said nothing either, leaving only the scrape of the shovel and the rustle of straw to fill the silence. From time to time, she looked up and met Elias's gaze, dark as the desert, heavy as judgment, before quickly lowering her eyes again. From the corner, Dusty snorted, a low, rumbling sound. He neither approached nor turned away, only tilted his head, listening to the music of labor, shovel, breath, silence. At last, Clara drew near his stall. She gathered a small bundle of hay, her hand hesitating midair. Dusty's dark eyes fixed on hers, not merely seeing her, but reflecting the losses he had borne. The flames in the night, Elias clutching the lifeless bodies of wife and child, the long years of solitude. Clara's chest tightened. In those eyes, she saw herself cast out, rootless, with nowhere left to return. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I've lost everything too." Her hand, trembling, stretched the hay toward him. Dusty snorted again, flicked his gray head, and unexpectedly lowered it. His great mouth closed over the offering, warm breath spilling against Clara's hand. Elias stiffened. For years, Dusty had never bowed to anyone but him. His eyes narrowed not with suspicion, but with something deeper, a flicker of wonder breaking through the stone. Clara did not pull her hand away. Instead, she laid her thin fingers along Dusty's brow, brushing the tangled mane. The horse did not resist. He closed his eyes, dipping his head even lower. A vow unspoken. Acceptance. For a moment, the stable itself seemed to still. The only sounds were Dusty's steady breath and the rush of Elias's heart. A glimmer sparked within him, something he had not felt in years. Trust, not trust in people, but in the judgment of the creature who had never left his side. Clara smiled faintly, the smallest of smiles, but enough to brighten the dim stable. Her shoulders eased, her hand grew steadier. Elias turned away, hiding his face. He would not let her see the tears threatening a cowboy's eyes, eyes that had watched death, now softened by a horse bowing its head. But inside, he felt the wall of silence crack. Sunlight slipped through the gaps in the planks, catching the dust and hay drifting in the air. Clara worked on, shoveling, cleaning, yet now and then she glanced back at Dusty, who stood watching her like a guardian. Elias stepped inside, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. The horses stirred uneasily, but Dusty's gaze did not leave Clara. The old horse struck the ground once with his hoof, as if declaring her presence safe. Clara stooped, lifting an old horseshoe buried in the straw. She turned it over, then set it carefully on the wooden rack. A small act, but Elias saw it for what it was, her attempt to honor every scrap of this home, as though it were already hers too. He drew in a breath, gave the faintest nod. No words, but anyone watching would know it was his first gesture of acceptance. Elias's heart ached, though not only with grief. It was the ache of a man long untouched by another's presence, now startled to find his horse and his home had chosen to accept her. And now I leave you with this thought. If you were standing there, would you trust the silence or wait for words to be spoken aloud? Part 3. The cowboy's eyes. The western afternoon wore a pale sun, its light breaking through thin clouds, casting long shadows across the yard scarred with hoof prints. Elias stood on the porch, arms folded, eyes fixed on Clara's figure as she bent over the broom inside the stable. Every stroke was slow, careful, steady. Not once did she complain. He was used to silence in this house, used to wind hissing through the cracks of rotted wood. But now, another sound had entered a broom's gentle scrape, and a faint tune Clara hummed under her breath. It was a small thing, yet enough to stop him cold. In Elias's gaze, eyes heavy as lead, something flickered. He saw in her a persistence that was no performance, no bargaining chip. It was something forged in the hard fires of being cast aside too many times. He lit a cigarette, smoke curling beneath the brim of his wide hat. He drew deep, let it out in a long sigh. And in that sigh, memories came rushing. His wife, once bending over this very yard, sweeping the dust away, their child chasing after loose straw in the wind. Past and present overlapped, and his chest clenched with an old ache. Clara stepped out into the yard, tying a bundle of straw with a strip of cloth. Her hair slipped free of its knot, a ragged scarf falling loose to the ground. The wind caught it, rolling it toward the porch. Elias bent, picked it up. It was nothing more than a worn scrap of fabric, edges frayed, color faded. Yet when he held it, he felt the pull of years. His wife once had a scarf just like it worn in the fields, scented with sun, sweat, and wood smoke. For a moment, the past breathed again. Clara looked up, startled, hand outstretched to take it back. Elias studied her longer than usual. His eyes, cold as stone for so long, softened. He returned the scarf, wordless, but in his gaze there was hesitation. A man caught between being chained to his grief or letting a sliver of light through. Clara bowed her head, lips parting as if to thank him. But she held the words back. The silence between them no longer felt like a wall, but like a fragile bridge waiting for someone to step across. That night, firelight danced along the cabin walls, throwing Clara's shadow long as she folded clothes and stacked firewood. Elias sat a few steps away, chair groaning beneath his frame. He didn't interfere, only watched in silence. Every small gesture of hers, the way she smoothed a cloth, the way she lifted a cup to drink, pulled his eyes toward her. He didn't know why. Perhaps because in her care, he caught echoes of the ordinary days he had once lived, now lost treasures beyond reach. He leaned back, closed his eyes halfway. In memory, he saw his boy climbing into his lap, snatching the cigarette from his lips, laughing with reckless joy. That memory tangled with the sound of Clara moving about the room, and his eyes grew damp. Elias covered his mouth, pretending to adjust his hat, not out of shame, but because a cowboy does not know what to do when his heart shows itself so bare. The next day, Elias led the horses to pasture from a distance. He saw Clara struggling with a heavy water bucket. Her steps faltered, her dress soaked with spilled water. Yet she did not quit for a heartbeat. Elias nearly moved to help. His foot lifted, then froze. His hand tightened on the reins. He had grown too used to watching people walk away, too used to helplessness in the face of fate. Now, even the simple act of reaching out unsettled him. Clara finally set the bucket down, wiped sweat from her brow with her sleeve. When she looked up, their eyes met. Tired as she was, there was a fierce light in her gaze, the determination of someone who refused to be broken. And in that moment, a crack split the wall around his heart. It didn't crumble, not yet, but it shook. Warning of the day it might, Elias turned aside, hiding the softness that had crept into his stare. But he knew he would not be the same. That evening, the sky bled red across the horizon. Clara sat on the steps, mending her dress with a thin strand of thread. Elias lingered in the shadow of the porch, watching quietly. The last light of day bathed her face, outlining every weary, defiant feature. Elias drew in a long breath, let it escape with a sigh that carried every memory he had buried deep. The sound was like the wind over the plains, rattling the saddles hanging on the wall. And in that moment, his eyes softened, no longer sharp with suspicion, no longer heavy as stone. They were like water after a storm, still deep, still dark, but calmer now. He didn't step closer, didn't speak, but his eyes confessed what his lips could not. The fortress of his loneliness had cracked, and her presence had already slipped into the memories he thought were sealed forever. Clara did not notice, her head bowed over her sewing. But had she looked up just then, she might have seen it the cowboy's eyes, changed, holding a truth not yet spoken, but trembling at the edge of words. Part 4. The Silent Night. That night brought no rain, only wind, low and restless, slipping through the cracks in the wood, carrying with it the scent of dry grass and earth. On the table, a small fire burned down in the stove, glowing red, its weak light brushing half of Clara's face. She sat close to it, arms around her knees, eyes fixed on the coals as though searching for an answer there. Elias sat opposite, his broad frame half hidden in shadow, only his eyes glinting beneath the brim of his wide hat. He was a man of few words, and tonight was no exception. Yet Clara felt his gaze on her, steady, quiet, like a lantern left burning just for her. The wind pressed against the porch, hinges creaking like the knock of old memories. Clara swallowed hard, her voice rough. "I've got nowhere to go. Only roads folks don't want me walking." Elias didn't move. He drew in slow on his cigarette, the smoke rising between them like a veil. He knew she was throwing pieces of her past into the silence, just to see if they would vanish, or if someone might finally hear. Her voice grew steadier, though it carried the weight of something worn thin. "When I was a girl, they called me the beggar's daughter. My father died in the street. My mother passed before I could remember her. I grew up on crusts of bread. People tossed my way. In town, their eyes said it plain I didn't belong." The fire cracked, casting her trembling shadow across the walls. Elias remained still, but his hand tightened on his knee. He knew that feeling, the kind of judgment that shackled a soul until you were something less than human. Clara blinked fast, her eyes rimmed red. When I got older, I tried to find work. They said I brought bad luck. Once, I cut my hand peeling an apple. Blood fell on the floor. They told me it was unclean, that it would spoil the harvest. They drove me out. After that, I wandered. Elias lifted his gaze. His eyes, deep as a canyon, held hers. He said nothing, yet his silence carried weight. It was belief. He knew what exile tasted like. He believed her. The room grew still, as if the outside world had vanished. Only the fading fire and the rise and fall of their breath remained. Clara wiped at her tears, forced a crooked smile. I don't know why I'm telling you this. People usually laugh when they hear my story. You could do the same. Elias ground out his cigarette, his rough hand drumming lightly on the table. He leaned forward, eyes steady on hers. He did not speak, but his gaze stopped her cold. It wasn't pity. It wasn't judgment. It was simply, I'm here, and I'm not turning away. Her shoulders eased, fingers unclenching from her skirt. For the first time, Clara felt no need to defend herself. His silence in this wind-haunted cabin, with the fire burning low, was the gentlest answer she'd ever known. She raised her head. Her eyes were swollen, but there was a question flickering inside them. Am I accepted? Elias braced an elbow on his knee, leaning slightly forward. The firelight caught his face at last, revealing not just the shadow of a man, but the scar of an old wound. Clara saw, yet the same loneliness she carried reflected back at her. The town whispered of the fire that had taken his wife and child, and now she understood. His silence was not indifference. It was grief, too heavy to voice for one fragile moment. No words were needed. They saw the wounds in each other's eyes, different in shape, but born of the same root, and in that recognition, the air between them grew less cold. Outside, the wind stilled. The ranch lay quiet, as though even the desert was holding its breath. Inside, the fire sank into embers. The last glow painting both their faces. Clara tilted her head, whispering, "Thank you for listening." Elias gave no reply, only a small nod, his eyes fixed on the coals. But within him, a door long shut creaked open. For years, he had let no one near the ruins of his pain. Yet tonight, through the voice of a wandering girl, he no longer felt the weight alone. No promises, no consolation, just presence. And in that silent night, two lonely hearts sat side by side, reminded by the steady beat within them that life had not yet let go. Part 5. Dawn on the ranch. Morning mist lay heavy over the fields, a pale veil softening the scars of the night before. The sun had yet to climb, but along the horizon, a faint band of amber spread, glinting against the damp roof beams of the ranch house. Clara rose before the rooster's crow. Her thin hands gathered dry straw, her narrow shoulders shivering against the cold of first light. The stable was still dark, filled only with the quiet snort of Dusty and the white breath spilling from his nostrils. Clara reached up, brushed her fingers through the old horse's mane, gave a soft pat, then set to work mucking stalls, spreading fresh hay, changing water. No one had asked her, no one had ordered it, but she worked as if it were the only way to prove she deserved to stay. From the porch, Elias watched. Hat brim drawn low, his face half hidden, he stood in silence. For years he had risen with the horses, alone, but now for the first time, someone else shared the rhythm of dawn, and in his chest, something stirred. A pulse he had nearly forgotten, the feeling of not being the only one left. He stepped forward, boots striking the hard wood with a sharp finality. Clara started, looked up at him. In her eyes was the old wariness, the fear that he might change his mind, that the door would close, as it always had before. Elias said little. He set a bucket down beside her, brimming with oats. His voice, gravel deep, slow as stone, carried across the space between them. "Feed the horses." Clara blinked, her hand trembling as she took the bucket. It was more than a command. It was trust. A cowboy did not let strangers lay hand to his horses, least of all Elias, whose herd was all that remained of his family. She nodded faintly, clutching the bucket to her chest, and walked toward the restless animals. The first wash of morning light struck her face, anxious still, but touched with pride. Elias stood back, watching, not to judge, not to condemn, but to see if the small trust he had placed in her could hold. Clara scattered the oats, hand by hand, into the troughs. The horses shifted, hooves pawing the ground, uncertain, her breath caught, heart pounding. Then Dusty stepped forward. The gray horse, bearer of all memory, lowered his head and ate from her hand. That simple act turned a key in Elias's chest, one that had stayed locked for years. Dusty had bowed for no one but him until now. One by one, the others followed, their heavy breaths mixing with Clara's ragged but steadying rhythm. The tension in the air melted into the sound of horses feeding. Alive and content, Elias stood motionless, his eyes softening. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe this ranch could live again. The past did not have to bind him. It could be the ground where new trust was sown. When the feeding was done, Clara turned. Sweat glistened on her brow, her dress stained with hay. She held the empty bucket, eyes flickering to Elias, uncertain. He stepped forward, gave a single nod, small but heavy with meaning. Clara lowered her gaze, her eyes shimmering. She smiled faintly, hiding the tear that threatened to fall. Elias' gaze drifted out over the fields. He remembered mornings with his wife and child feeding horses, laughter rising with the sun. The memory tightened his chest. But this time, it did not suffocate. Instead, it stretched forward, reaching into the present. Clara had not replaced what was lost, but she had filled a hollow he thought would remain forever empty. His eyes softened, like water after a storm. And Clara, in that instant, knew she had been accepted. The sun lifted higher, pulling back the mist, spilling gold across the ranch. From somewhere beyond, a rooster crowed. Dusty gave a long, ringing neigh. Clara stooped to gather stray bundles of hay, moving with quiet purpose. Elias stood at the porch, hand resting on the post where his family's names were carved. He watched her, and for once, his eyes no longer looked alone. She turned, met his gaze. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Yet something invisible bound them, a thread of trust, fragile but real. Born that morning in the stable, Elias breathed deep, and for the first time in years, the air in his chest did not feel like it belonged to him alone. Clara bowed her head, smiling softly, and went back to her work. The ranch, once a prison of silence, now carried a new heartbeat. Trust had been planted, and from trust, a home was beginning to rise again. Part 6. An old wound. Evening settled cool across the desert, the wind carrying the scent of dry earth and withered grass. Elias sat alone on the porch, boots propped against the worn step. Something small, glinting in his hand beneath the sinking sun. Clara came out, meaning to gather firewood, but stopped short. The fading light caught on the silver resting in his palm. It was a necklace old, but finely etched, a small flower carved into its surface, worn by years, but still holding grace. Elias turned it slowly, his calloused fingers tracing every scar in the metal. In that moment, he was not the hardened cowboy the town whispered about, but a man who carried a wound that never closed. Clara did not ask. She didn't need to. The way his eyes clung to that silver told her what it was. Not an ornament, but a gravestone small enough to carry. At last Elias looked up. For a second, he thought to hide it, to pocket the past once more. But his hand trembled, an unsteadiness no gunfight had ever drawn from him. His voice came low, raw, as wood burning slow. My wife wore it. The night the house caught fire. Clara froze. Each word struck like a stone, he went on, voice breaking. Though his eyes stayed dry, I'd stepped out to bring the horses in. When I came back, the flames had swallowed the roof. I heard my boy crying inside, but I couldn't reach him. Smoke, wind, fire. It was all against me. His grip tightened around the necklace, as if the pain must be driven into metal for him to bear it. Clara lowered herself beside him. Neither spoke. In the amber hush of sunset, their shadows stretched long across the porch. One man breaking himself open, one woman listening with the gentlest silence she could give. Her chest ached. She knew loss, but not like this. Not as fire-stealing voices out of a house. Yet she understood the shape of being unwanted, the shape of emptiness. Softly, she said, "People used to call me a burden, said I shouldn't have been born. I didn't lose anyone, but I lost myself." Elias turned, his eyes deep as midnight. No surprise there, no judgment, only recognition. She had named her wound, and he accepted it as he did his own. They sat that way, no one reaching to heal, but both knowing they weren't alone in the hurt anymore. Elias drew in a hard breath, as though to swallow the ache back into his chest. His gaze wandered out across the fields, where the sun bled red into the horizon. "Cowboys don't cry," he muttered, voice splintering. "But losing the ones you love, there's no doctor for that wound." Clara tilted her head, catching the faint quiver in his mouth. He had carried years in silence, carving names into wood beams, living in the echo of ashes. Now, because of one silver chain, all of it had spilled free. She reached out, hesitated, her hand hovering near the necklace, not to take it, only to share the weight. Elias saw the gesture, gave a small nod, and for the first time, he set the necklace down on the table between them. It was a sign that he no longer kept it pressed against his heart like a stone, but let another see. Darkness gathered, swallowing the last of daylight. On the wooden table, the silver pendant caught the final glimmer of sun, shining like a tear turned to steel. Elias sat heavy, but somehow lighter, the long sigh in his chest, not quite so bitter. Clara's eyes lingered on the pendant, then on him. No promises, no talk of replacing what was gone, only the silence that bridged the gap. From the stable came Dusty's soft whinny, a reminder that life still waited. Elias laid a hand on the post where his family's names were carved, then turned back. His eyes, gentled by shadow, found Clara. She bowed her head, tears gathering but unshed. And she knew the past would never leave him, but she had been allowed to step into the space it left behind. And in that moment, the cowboy did not cry, but the listener surely would. Part 7. The unexpected moment. The fire had burned down to coals, glowing faint against the hush of the cabin. Clara sat curled on the long bench, clutching her worn cloth bag, her eyes fixed on the window, where only darkness pressed back. Questions circled in her mind like coyotes at the edge of a camp. Had she truly been accepted here, or was she only a guest passing through? And when the day came that he turned her out, where would she go then? Outside, the wind swept across the plains, rattling through the fences, whispering with the same cruel voices she'd known in town. "That girl brings nothing but bad luck. Don't let her stay." Clara bit her lip, fingers gripping the bag's frayed edge until her knuckles blanched. In the next room, Elias slept, his soft snore mingling with the steady breath of horses outside. To Clara, that sound was both comfort and reminder that she was living inside a world that was not hers. Tears welled, falling onto the fabric beneath her cheek. She knew one day he could shut the door on her like the rest. Better to leave on her own terms. Better to walk away with pride than to wait for rejection. Before dawn, Clara rose. She gathered the little she owned, a faded scarf, a scrap of bread, a small knife. She stuffed them into her torn bag, pulled the rope tight. Her hand lingered on the blanket Elias had given her that first night. Slowly, she folded it and laid it neatly on the table as though repaying a debt. Her eyes, red from tears, hardened with resolve. The early wind slipped through the door frame. Sharp and cold, Clara stepped onto the porch, gazing out over the fields blanketed in white mist. Beyond lay the road she knew too well, the same one that had cast her aside again and again. And yet, it was the only road that remained. She breathed deep, as if to hold one last trace of warmth from this house inside her chest. A voice whispered from within, "You're nothing but a guest here. Better to go now, before you're turned away." Clutching her bag, Clara stepped lightly across the porch. But when her boot touched the stair, the wood gave a sharp creak. She froze, heart hammering. Fear pressed in. Fear of being seen. Fear of being cast out. Yet worse than either was the fear of being abandoned. Tears stung her eyes. She had always been the one to leave, not by choice, but because others had forced it. This time, it was her decision. Still, each step felt heavy as stone. Elias's face flashed in her mind. The man hunched on the porch with a silver locket in his hand, his eyes hollowed by loss. She knew that staying might only remind him of what he had lost, not what he could find again. Her tears spilled freely, soaking her sleeve as she stumbled toward the dark field. Inside the house, Elias stirred. A cowboy's instincts woke him at the slightest change. The draft slipping through the door, the groan of the floorboards, the sudden emptiness in the cabin. He felt them all. He rose, boots thudding soft against the wood. Stepping onto the porch, his eyes caught her. Clara's slight figure slipping away into the mist, her shoulders hunched, her gait uncertain, as if the next gust of wind might carry her off. Elias gripped the doorframe, torn. Should he call her back? For years, survival had meant silence, closing his gates, letting no one inside. To stop her now was to open himself once more, to risk losing all over again. But then he saw her wipe her face with a trembling sleeve, and in that small, broken gesture, he saw his son again, the boy who once cried out in fear of being left behind. Clara reached the edge of the yard, her shadow dissolving in the pale fog. She dropped her bag, pressed a hand to her chest, choking on her own breath. Behind her came the heavy, steady thud of boots. Elias stepped down from the porch. His voice carried across the cold air, low, rough, unsteady. "Where are you going?" Clara turned, her eyes wet with tears, her mouth opened. But no words came, only the sound of her breath breaking and the tears running down her dirt-streaked cheeks. In that moment, Elias saw it all, her fear of abandonment, her pride worn thin, her desperate hunger for belonging. It was a wound he knew too well, and in that instant, the wall he had built for years gave way. He took another step, his shadow stretching across the mist until it touched hers. The surprise of that night was not that she chose to leave, but that he chose not to let her. Part 8. The Cowboy's Words. Morning fog spread across the fields, a pale shroud softening the scars of yesterday. First light split the horizon, streaking gold across damp wood and restless earth. Clara walked near the fence line, her frail shoulders trembling beneath a thin shawl. The old cloth bag dragged heavy at her side, filled with little more than fear and surrender. Behind her came the sound of boots on timber, a cowboy's stride, firm and echoing through the dawn. Elias stood at the porch post, his figure tall in the mist, hat brim shadowing his face. His voice rose low, raw, but unshaken. "Clara," she flinched, turned. It wasn't the bark of command, nor the edge of judgment. It was the voice of a man who had already lost too much and feared losing again. For a heartbeat, the world hushed. Only the wind across the pasture and Clara's pounding heart remained. She met his eyes, at last, no longer hidden beneath the brim. They held storms and scars, but beneath the pain flickered something rare, a silent plea. Elias stepped down from the porch, boots striking earth with weight. He stopped just short, his voice trembling like wind on a mountain ridge. "You're not a burden." The words hit her harder than any blow. Her fingers tightened on the bag, and tears spilled free. All her life, she had waited for someone, anyone, to speak against the voices that named her worthless. And here, at last, it came. Neither moved. Their eyes bridged the distance, banishing the emptiness that had haunted them both. The wind swept through the fence rails, bowing the brittle grass. Elias drew a long breath. His hand fell from the buckle of his belt, loosening as though laying down a weight he had carried for years. "If you want," his voice slow, each word carved deep as if into oak, "this is your home." Clara froze. The bag slipped from her shoulder, falling hard against the dirt. Her lips parted, but no sound came. For Elias, the words were no pity, no charity. They were promise, a cowboy's vow plain, unadorned, yet heavier than all the oaths in Scripture. For his kind, words were scarce, but when spoken, they bore the weight of a lifetime. Clara crumpled, hands to her face, years of rejection, the slamming of doors, the laughter behind her back, all shattered in a single moment. No longer a beggar at the threshold, no longer a wanderer asking. For the first time, someone had opened the door and said, "This is your home." Elias bent, his rough hand resting on her shoulder. He did not speak, but in that small pressure was his oath. She would not drift alone again. Her tears were no longer only of pain. They carried the aching sweetness of being seen, of being claimed. She lifted her gaze, and in his eyes, she found it the trust she had long thought she'd never deserve. Sunlight spread, bleeding red, across the prairie. Dusty stepped from the stable, gave a soft, ringing whinny, as though to bear witness. Clara rose to her feet, standing before Elias. She did not ask again. She did not doubt. She simply nodded, tears shining like morning dew. Elias picked up her bag, set it on the porch step. Then, with a quiet strength, he opened the door behind him. No grand gesture, no speech, just a door held wide for her. The ranch, once filled only with wind and memory, now held a new breath. A cowboy had opened his heart, and a wanderer had found a home. From that morning forward, silence no longer weighed like stone. It became a vow instead. We will not be alone again. Part 9. A Home in Silence. The sun lifted slow across the horizon, spilling pale gold over the fields. Dew clung to the wooden rails, sparkling like tiny diamonds. Clara, sleeves rolled, swept straw across the yard. Her bare feet were dusted with earth, but her stride was steady. Elias leaned against the porch post, watching. His eyes no longer carried the chill they once did. Now they were the eyes of a man seeing his homestead breathe again. He stepped down, lifted the bucket at the well, and poured fresh water into the trough. They worked side by side, wordless, no commands, no questions, only the small music of life returning, the rasp of a broom, the splash of water, the steady beat of hooves against dirt. Together, it became a hymn of peace, one Elias had thought was lost forever. In that space, silence was no longer a chain. It wrapped around them gentle as morning light. Clara dragged a bundle of hay, her small frame straining. Elias stepped forward without a word, took the other end. They pulled together, their footsteps pressing twin marks into the damp ground. Sweat dampened their brows, the dawn gleam painting their shoulders. Clara panted softly, yet a smile broke across her lips. For the first time, she wasn't working alone. Elias glanced sideways, caught that smile, and felt his chest ease. For years, he had carried it all. The herd, the ranch, the weight of memory. But now, in sharing even this small burden, he discovered something else. Not weakness, renewal. When Clara stumbled carrying a water bucket, Elias caught her arm quick and firm. She laughed a light, sudden sound, bright enough to startle the horses. Elias froze. That laugh cracked open the shell of heaviness that had long sealed the ranch. A breeze stirring dust that had lain for years. His lips tugged upward, hesitant, faint yet true. His first real smile in years. Clara's laughter faltered into a soft gasp. Her eyes shimmered as she saw. It saw the rare, fragile smile of a man who had lost everything, now finding a reason to keep living. When the work was done, they sat on the porch steps. The breeze carried the scent of hay and the distant echo of hooves. Clara let her hands rest, leaning back against the step. Elias sat beside her, gaze stretching out to the horizon. Their breaths moved in rhythm, 2 heartbeats slowly falling in step. Elias slipped the hat from his head and set it beside his boots. For a cowboy, it was a small act, but it meant something more, a surrender of his guard. He turned, caught Clara's gaze. No words were spoken, but in his eyes, he gave a vow, "I will not leave you behind." Tears rolled down Clara's cheeks, but she did not lower her head. She let them fall with her smile, marking the silence as something holy. The sun rose higher, burning the mist away. Dusty wandered into the yard, gave a soft whinny, then lowered his head to graze. Elias looked at Clara, and this time his smile was sure, unhidden. Her breath caught, heart tightening. All the years of being cast out, all the fear of being left dissolved in that one simple smile. Silence was no longer a gulf between them. It was shelter. They did not need words. Their shadows stretched across the grass, joining in the morning light, and from that moment on, silence itself became their vow. We will stay. Part 10. Sunset and a new home. The sun sank low across the prairie, laying down a red blanket over the land. The sky shifted from gold to amber, then deepened to the color of dying embers. The last light cut through the old fence rails, falling across Elias's broad frame as he leaned against the porch post, hat brim shadowing half his face. Clara gathered the last bundle of straw, sweat dampening her dress, yet her eyes shone with a quiet peace. She paused, looking up at the sky. For the first time, she felt no fear, no sense of wandering. From the barn came Dusty's low whinny. The old horse stepped into the yard, hooves tapping steady against the hard earth. He stood in the fading light, like a bridge, one hoof planted in grief, the other in something being reborn. Elias's eyes drifted to Clara, his gaze softened, no longer bound by silence. He realized he was not living only for memory, but for this moment, when sunset wasn't just an ending, but a beginning. Clara joined him on the porch. Their shadows stretched long across the dust, folding together in the crimson light. The silence between them was not the weight of strangers anymore, but a gentle stillness, like balm laid over an old wound. Elias struck a match, drew smoke from a cigarette, and quietly held the pack toward her. A simple gesture, but tender. She shook her head, smiling faintly. He nodded, exhaled a long ribbon of smoke. Clara rested a hand on the porch rail, her eyes on the road cutting off into the desert. Once, that road had been her only fate, a place of exile, but standing beside Elias, it no longer held the same terror. They looked together toward the horizon, and in that shared silence, both knew a home is not always where you're born. Sometimes it's where someone chooses to keep you. Dusty circled once, then came to stand before them, lowering his head as though in ritual. He had witnessed loss. Now he bore witness to renewal. Clara stroked his mane, warmth passing through her fingers. Elias watched, and the corner of his mouth curved the rarest smile. No longer trapped in memory, but freed for the present. Dusty became the symbol of it all, the tether from sorrow to hope. If even the old horse could bow his head, then the ranch had truly become a home again. Elias set his hat aside, ran a hand through hair streaked with gray, and lowered himself onto the porch step. Clara sat beside him, leaving space, yet close enough. They listened to the crickets begin their song, to the whisper of wind through dry grass. Then Elias did something he had not in years. He laughed, low, rough, brief, but real. Clara turned, startled. It was the sound of a man no longer captive to the shadows. Her heart clenched, then lifted, and she laughed softly in return, tears bright in the fading light. Together, their silence became a vow, deeper than any spoken word. Night settled violet across the land. Dusty pawed once at the earth, as though sealing the day. Elias rose, reached out his rough hand. Clara hesitated, then placed her small, calloused fingers into his. His grip was steady, warm. They walked inside together. The wooden door closed behind them, not shutting the world out, but closing the circle of a home reborn. The ranch was no longer only the echo of grief. It had become a beginning, a place where two shattered souls and one old horse had stitched a roof over their hearts. It was not a story of grand vows, but of quiet moments. A hand offered, a smile returned, a horse's bowed head. Together, these small things built a home stronger than words. The evening wind carried the smell of hay and the faint smoke of the hearth. Once a place of silence and sorrow, the ranch now breathed with life broom on the floorboards, wood snapping in the fire, Dusty's gentle call echoing soft through the yard. Clara stood on the porch, her hair brushed by the last traces of sun, and smiled, not with trembling, but with certainty. Elias stood beside her, gave the smallest nod, and in that silence, one promise rang louder than any words. We stay. The man who thought he'd lost everything, and the woman who thought she had nowhere left, had built a home out of ashes. It was the gentlest justice the harsh West could grant. And maybe the lesson left lingering for those who listen is this: no one is too broken to begin again. And sometimes, silence itself is the deepest vow of all. As the sky darkened to purple, three shadows marked the earth: one cowboy, one woman, and an old horse. They stretched into one shape beneath the fading light. No oaths spoken, no promises demanded, only presence. And that, in the end, was love in its purest form. And now, a final question for you, listening here at the edge of the West. Have you ever met someone who made you feel at home? And if you stood in the cowboy's boots, would you stay to protect the town or ride off into the wild